in the fuel market to competition to reduce the strategic importance of oil and the ability of oil price spikes to wreak havoc on our economy. There is a bill called the Open Fuel Standard Act, introduced by Congressman Shimkus and Congressman Engel, that are right here to make a few opening comments. And the focus of the bill is ensuring that new cars enable fuel competition of some sort. After the congressmen say their words, we're going to turn to our panel of speakers, and I'll introduce them after the congressmen speak. Okay, so let me introduce our speakers. Thank you to the congressmen. Our speakers first are Robert Zubrin, who is author of a book some of you may have read called Energy Victory, Winning the War on Terror by Breaking Free Oil. Next we have General Wesley Clark. Frank Gaffney, who runs the Center for Security Policy, which is one of the preeminent think tanks focused on security and defense thinking in this town. General Wesley Clark, who was the Supreme Commander of NATO and now runs Growth Energy, which is focused on really alternative to oil and specifically ethanol. And then Jim Woolsey, who was former director of Central Intelligence and has really been one of the leading thinkers on the energy security issue for a very long time.
This way quite well. The first thing you tend to get asked in this debate is, if this is such a good idea, why didn't it happen before? Well, there's several answers to that. One is that with respect to ethanol, it has happened before. It happened in Brazil and it works just fine. And part of what we are trying to do is persuade the Congress and the American people that we can be as shrewd, as practical, as sensible, and as straightforward as the Brazilians. That's not often a place the United States finds itself in international comparisons, but I would say tip a hat to the Brazilians. They had a couple of false starts, they learned from them, they did this right, and you saw the consequences in Bob's briefing. A second reason it has not moved as far and fast as some of us would have liked in the past is that the price of oil and the price of natural gas have tracked one another for a long time. There's still a lot of long-term contracts out in the Pacific and Asia where they are basically for a unit of energy equivalent, and they have been that way for a long time. What's happened new is hydrofracturing. Being able to combine horizontal drilling with the fracking, which has been done since the 1940s for vertical wells. Combining those two has been absolutely revolutionary. The gas man, not the senator, George Mitchell, did this. He did it a lot by himself. He sacrificed his own personal fortune in the face of total derision by his comrades in the natural gas business and everybody else. And he pulled it off, and it works. And yes, you've got to do the environmental side of it right. You've got to make sure that you don't drill disposal wells in geology that can't take them. You've got to treat wastewater right. But more and more people are coming to understand that, and it's doable. You just have to do it. Once you are able to have gas for $2.50 per million BTUs, which is where it is now, and oil is up $100 plus per barrel, you are in a world in which a unit, BTU, or any unit of energy is 7-8 times more expensive if it's oil than if it's natural gas. So what didn't make sense before with respect to making methanol, let's say, out of natural gas, when the units of energy for oil and gas were essentially the same price, now, with a factor of 7 to 8 price advantage for natural gas, it makes a lot of sense. And so one of the things that's happened is what has happened throughout American history, technological innovation in in this case by a brilliant and determined and really stubborn individual, has brought off a way to have natural gas cheaply. And we've tended to, for some years, make methanol out of natural gas in the United States. Works just fine. Human beings know how to make methanol just the way they know how to make ethanol. They've been making ethanol for, God, millennia. They've been making methanol for at least 400 or 500 years. So this is not something new. This is not complicated. This is not different. Being able to have both is entirely plausible. Another thing, and I tip my hat to Wes for fighting back against this, I'm sure, for some time. Another thing that has been going on is, I would say, an extraordinary degree of deception on the part of some oil interests and certainly the junk food industry with respect to ethanol. First of all, you don't have really a fuel-food conflict with ethanol made out of corn. You have a food-fat, you have a fuel-fat conflict. Why do I say that? In a modern ethanol plant, you put the corn through, and first of all, about 1% of American corn is grown for corn on the cob and corn chowder. The rest is grown for some combination of ethanol and animal feed. You take an acre that's being used for animal feed and say, okay, now I'm going to use it for ethanol. The corn goes through the ethanol plant, but about a third of it comes out as distiller's dry grain. It's heated. It becomes perfectly fine animal feed. The 2/3, roughly, that's not, is the cornstarch. Now, you can take the cornstarch, turn it into sugar, ferment it, drive on it, ethanol. Or you can do what is largely done now. The junk food manufacturers take the cornstarch to the big consolidated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, otherwise known as cattle hell because they live in this tiny cage for their entire lives, and they jam the cornstarch down their throats. Makes them terribly sick. You've got to give them huge tons of antibiotics. Why do they do that? One purpose and one purpose only: to make meat fatter. The entire purpose is fat. Okay, well, if you're not going to do that, what else do you do with the cornstarch? You turn it into fructose. Well, the junk food manufacturers have noticed that only about a third of American children are obese, so they figure there's plenty of room for double-digit growth, right? If you just get in the business of substituting fructose for dextrose and sucrose, it's a quarter the price. Makes it a lot easier to make profits out of junk food. So Wes and the other folks who have been pushing ethanol have run into an extraordinarily deceptive, I would say, even for this world of Washington lobbying, an extraordinarily deceptive attack on these grounds. And I think if you look at the promise for ethanol and for methanol, you have a very, very natural way to be able to use what we have, whether it's vegetation or natural gas, and turn it into an alternative fuel. Now, the prices of these, it's going to vary. It's going to vary with how much is imported from Brazil. It's going to vary with the price of natural gas and so on. But the point is to put the decision-making in the hands of the consumer as he or she drives into the filling station, just the way the Brazilians do, and let the consumer decide. Finally, a point on this cost business of methanol. Bob has gotten into this further than anybody I know, but let me see if I say this right. Insofar as you are looking at a new car, there is, for all practical purposes, zero added cost to its being a flexible fuel vehicle. You program the computer in the car in such a way that it can be flex fuel with ethanol or methanol. And if you want it to be flex fuel for methanol as well as ethanol, you've got to replace a couple of O-rings. Rubber O-rings instead of kind of plastic material. Those are each one 40-some cents cheaper than the O-rings that the manufacturers use now, so save 80 cents a car. And you are in the business of having a vehicle that is flex fuel with respect to ethanol and methanol. Now, if you have to take an existing car in and get it reprogrammed, and especially to drive on methanol, get some O-ring work done, yeah, you could be up there in the ballpark of $100, $200, something like that for existing cars. But for new cars, there is absolutely no reason in God's green earth not to require those all to be flex fuel with respect to ethanol and methanol. It costs essentially nothing. What in the world is going on here? Why don't the car companies just say, well, sure, fine, no problem? Well, one is that they get a credit on the CAFE standards for coming out with flex fuel vehicles, and I think they want to make people believe that it's really hard to do or it takes something. Maybe they won't get their credit anymore if they admit that it's cost-free for a new vehicle. I don't know. You'd have to psychoanalyze, ask them sometimes. What they put in the letter that they released today is that it costs billions with an S to have flex fuel vehicles. Well, last year, their lobbying letter said $1 billion a year. Well, 10 million cars in the U.S. every year, that's $100 a car. Okay? If it did cost something, and the car companies usually have been saying it's about $100 a car, okay, instead of zero, say $100. That's about $1 billion for the entire auto industry in the U.S. a year. That is so much less than seat belts, airbags, right kind of picture for your television set, other mandates. Instead, what they are doing is choosing for you and me a mandate from OPEC. The people who write these letters, the lobbyists who put out this nonsense about corn ethanol and about the cost of adding flex fuel vehicles that are methanol, people who put that out are not arguing even close to responsibly. People get to argue in this country. They get to argue in the Congress and before the Congress, and that's fine. But they ought to have some kind of respect for fact. The people who are opposing flex fuel, open standard, are not meeting that criterion. Bob and I have challenged them several times to a debate, and they always figure out some reason why they're busy that night.
Or any night.
Even the bald guys need to wash their hair, they say that. We don't. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you very much to our speakers.